Good evening, everyone, and welcome to the Crocker Art Museum. My name is Houghton Kinsman, and I'm the Adult Education Coordinator here at the museum. Before we begin tonight's program, I will read a land acknowledgement. We acknowledge that the Crocker Art Museum is on the traditional, unceded land of the Nisenan people, and the current state of California is the homeland of many tribes. We are honored to be here today and acknowledge our responsibility to these Native nations and our commitment to work with them as we move forward as an inclusive institution. So I want to thank you all for joining us here this evening. We have a great program in store for you. Tonight I'm joined by artist Farrow to discuss his quintessential work, The White House, which is currently on display at the Crocker. But before we get started, a few housekeeping notes and logistics. Tonight's program will be available to view again on YouTube. The link will be emailed to all members and program registrants. Please use the chat for any comments and any questions you would like us to answer during the program. I'd also like to take this opportunity to thank all of our members joining us here today. Your continued support is especially vital at this moment in time. And to everyone who donated so generously to this program and to those joining us in attendance, thank you too. Without these contributions and your presence, this program wouldn't be possible. So thank you all. All that said, anyone interested in gifting a membership, or for those of you wanting to explore the benefits of a membership of your own, and for those who haven't renewed yet or simply wish to donate, we're going to throw some of those links in the chat now. Along with those, we will add links to our fancy new online store. I have my Crocker mug here, and our calendar events page, where you can sign up for upcoming programs. Now back to Farrow. Although the exhibition closes on February 28th, you can still experience it online. There is a great 360-degree virtual tour that you have to check out. Links to that experience and other Farrow-related content will pepper the chat over the course of the next hour. Before I introduce our wonderful guest this evening, I want to acknowledge the fraught social-political conditions in which this talk takes place. The events over the past few weeks haven't been easy to watch and come to terms with. Inviting Farrow to talk here today is about exploring the way art, politics, and social conditions so very often overlap, and how artists and exhibitions challenge us to explore different perspectives, ideas, and subject matters, no matter how controversial or how strongly they butt up against our personal views. We welcome dialogue and debate here today, but we ask that you assume good or neutral intentions, show up however you can, and know that every voice is welcome and valued. In this space, we expect that people will have respect and empathy in their comments. Anyone using abusive or hateful language will be blocked. We don't anticipate this, but want to be clear so everyone understands. To kick us off, let us know in the chat if you've had a chance to see the exhibition. And now I'd like to welcome Farrow. Farrow has had numerous solo exhibitions since 1970 and is currently represented by Catharine Clark Gallery in San Francisco. His work has been in group shows at the Oakland Art Gallery, the San Francisco Arts Commission Gallery, Falkirk Cultural Center in Marin, and the San Francisco Art Institute, among many others. He has over 20 years of bronze casting experience, and his work is in many important private and public collections around the world, including the San Francisco Museum of Modern Art and other collections in New York, Germany, and Hong Kong. So please join me in welcoming Al to our stream. Hey Al, how are you?
I'm good, thank you. Thank you for making this happen.
Where are you joining us from tonight? From your studio or from home? Okay.
I'm at home. I've elected to be in a comfortable environment to do this talk. My studio is cold and not so comfortable.
Okay. The objects in the background look very interesting. Before we get started, I pull up the PowerPoint, Al. I wanted to ask you what it's felt like returning to the Crocker since the last time you exhibited here, almost 5 years ago now.
Well, it's a great pleasure, actually. I really love the Crocker Museum. I personally think it's got the best collection I've ever seen of California artists. And I'm actually really glad to be in the collection and also be an exhibiting artist.
Awesome. So I'm going to pull up the PowerPoint now because I know we have a really wonderful program planned. And in planning for this discussion, you mentioned to me that the last time you spoke at the Crocker, you had to be dragged off the stage because everybody was so interested and you couldn't stop talking.
Yeah, the question and answer went on and on. There were so many curiosities. The lecture lasted 2 hours, and the museum closed, and they informed us all we had to leave, so I had to cut it short. But it was a really great lecture.
I remember you mentioning that your grandson had something really interesting to say about that talk.
Oh yeah, he was about 12 years old at the time, and he said afterward that the question and answer was the most fascinating part of the whole talk. Of course, he was familiar with everything I'd ever done,
yeah.
But he gave me the feedback that showing the work, and I also got tremendous feedback from the general public, that showing the construction behind it was the first time. That talk 5 years ago was the first time I'd actually shown the work behind the finished work. I normally just show finished work. And so that inspired this talk to indicate how I approached it, how I make it, how I start, how I, lay it out. All that stuff seems to be really important to people. One of the points is that my work is designed not to show any welds or screws or bolts or any methods of attachment. So I hide all that. And that makes people really wonder, how do these things go together? So this is going to be aimed at giving a little bit of insight to that.
I couldn't have set it up any better myself. So I'll pull up the PowerPoint here.
Okay.
And then sort of as we move along here. So sort of thinking about this talk in the shadow of the US presidential inauguration, we've broken it up into 3 parts. Part 1 is the White House at the Crocker, sort of discussing the installation and some other topics related to the White House. And then we revisit Divine Ammunition, jog your memory a bit, and then sort of finish with some of those process images that you were talking about a little earlier on. So I thought we could kick off the conversation today, Al, with sort of a bit of a backstory as we look at this wonderful image of the White House. How the White House ended up at the Crocker.
Well, we've been talking about it. The chief curator, Scott, and I have talked about showing it, and the original concept was to show it before the election, so that, and being the museum being so close to the state capitol, just a short distance away, we just thought it would be really, really interesting for people to engage in this point of view of the White House being corroded and such. But because of the coronavirus, we weren't allowed to even install. And so we finally got it installed in July, but the museum was closed almost all the time till now. And I guess they're still closed. Maybe it was open 10 days in that whole 6-month or so period. So this talk is important to me because a lot of people who may not have seen it will get a fuller viewing of it.
Sort of on that point, can I ask where it was first exhibited, Al?
At the Museum of Craft and Design in San Francisco. That was, I've been working on it for 2 years before that. And I was aiming to introduce the sculpture at that show. I almost ran out of time and had to have a bunch of friends come over and help me with some of the work at the very last couple of weeks, because there's so much detail in there that I didn't anticipate how much time it would actually take.
And then from the Museum of Craft and Design, where did it go to next?
It went to a museum in Dallas, and that was the only other place it got shown. Between those shows and after that show, it was just sitting in crates at my studio, and so I was delighted when the Crocker wanted to show it.
Yeah, we're looking at some of the installation shots now. So it's in the Weeble Gallery at the Crocker, which is on the 3rd floor of the museum. Do you want to talk us through some of these installation shots, Al?
Well, it's a really amazing gallery. That there's so much natural light. I've never actually exhibited anything in such intense natural light. So it was new for me. You can see the windows behind. It's a beautiful gallery space, and it's the first and only time that I've had only one sculpture as an exhibition. But it is a big sculpture.
So did you feel like there was extra pressure? It was especially daunting trying to say everything that you wanted to say in an exhibition with just one work of art?
Everything I had to say is I said. It's there, and it's making the statement, and it will always make a statement. I think it'll be viewed in terms of these times of politics and division and all that. And I think it will ultimately be viewed in those terms. Although I did not initially design this piece during the Trump era.
Okay.
Initially, I was thinking of doing the White House when George W. Bush was president, when the Iraq war started, and there was all that business about nuclear materials and all that. And I was really upset in those days, and I decided to do it. But by the time I got started, Obama was elected, and that gave me hope. And I discontinued my plan. When Trump was elected, he inspired me to revisit the project and actually try to accomplish it.
And in sort of preparing and doing some research around this work for the talk, I know you had thought about sort of the expanding power of the presidency sort of over the last 40 years, and in particular around the way presidents sometimes use the office to go to war without the support of Congress. What sort of got you interested in that topic, and why?
Well, what you mentioned about Congress having the power to declare war and not the president is one of the main reasons I got into it. But the presidency has been expanded even more than 40 years. Franklin Roosevelt really expanded the power of the presidency. Truman did as well. And then it just kept going from there. And in recent times, it's, in my opinion, it's gotten a little bit out of hand, where I think Congress has lost power and the presidency has expanded. But there's also so much corruption that's occurred that this whole thing is aimed at dealing with the corrosion of the system. But the White House, being an iconic symbol of the United States and the center of power, that's why I used it as a symbol.
I love the way that it sits in the Weeborg, with that sort of corroding, rusting edifice, with the natural light sort of shining on it. Sort of is an apt way of thinking about how you're highlighting some of those topics. One of the things that is especially striking about the White House for me is its architectural quality. And I wanted to ask you how pivotal the architectural process is in your work, or do you approach these works less from a structural point of view and more from a social political angle?
Well, the social political angle is very important to me, but I usually have a concept. Most of my work for the last 25 years had to do with religion and war and that relationship of violence and religion. And this was a departure. This is probably the first purely political sculpture that I made. I had the concept, and it was very singular and just a simple vision that I was aiming at all the way through.
What prompted transition from like larger body of work, which is sites of worships and reliquaries, to the White House? Was there something in particular?
Could you repeat that?
Like what prompted that shift from sites of worship and reliquaries, which make up the larger body of your work, to the White House? Was there something in particular?
Well, it was the politics of the times. I have been involved in politics since I was a teenager, and I've been an activist, not radical activist, but an activist in the Vietnam War time. I was protesting and marching and all that, writing letters and doing things like that. And at a certain point in my personal development, I realized that I didn't have much effect in that way of protesting. And I thought putting it in art, where the art will live longer than me for sure, and maybe much longer. I thought at least it would, if I could do it correctly, it would be interpreted and reinterpreted as time went on. So I think that there are some issues, like, for example, the relationship between violence and religion. I think that's been going on for thousands of years, and probably will still go on for thousands more years. But I don't try to influence people's decisions or points of view. I want them to think. What I'm trying to do, I'm not actually giving any answers to anything. I'm actually posing questions, and I would like people to think about the things they see in front of them. And so the materials I choose are violent materials, and then when you juxtapose them against religion or an iconic political building, it jars, and it's supposed to jar people into thinking about the relationships between, why is this guy putting all this violent material in a pretty image, and in the case of the White House, usually the architecture that I choose translates well into armament.
Okay.
But the White House doesn't. It's kind of a Palladian in the front, and it's colonial, and it's got all these different elements, but it doesn't have stuff that translates readily into armament. So this was very challenging for me to stuff as much armament into it as I could, like the walls at the lowest level, and the railings all being made out of shell cartridges.
It's going to be great to get a closer look at some of the process and some of the images from in your studio as you're putting this together. I'm glad you brought up the passage of time. I love this picture. It also gives you sort of a sense of the scale of the White House, right?
Yeah, it's big. It's about 6 feet by 7 feet in footprint.
Out of interest, do you know how much it weighs?
It weighs just short of 2,000 pounds.
Wow.
And it's made in 3 sections.
Okay. Is it possible to give us an idea of where they join? Based on the picture?
Maybe in some of the close-ups we can do that, but I can't point. I don't have a pointer, so I can't really show where they join. But the attempt is to make it seamless visually, and it is pretty successful.
Agreed. So thinking about the passage of time, we look at some of the details here. We'll get to your Divine Ammunition exhibition shortly. This is a particularly striking image.
Yeah, this is the South Portico. And interestingly, the North Portico is 1 story higher than the South Portico. So it was very challenging for me to devise a way to not be too jarring, because the back is 1 story lower than the front. And so that was very challenging to actually try to pull off, but it works. I love the back view here, this South Portico, because of all the details, the curved stairways and all that. It's just, for me, it's marvelous. I would like to point out that the columns are machine gun barrels, and I'll show some details of the capitals and such, and that the columns against the walls are really something called pilasters. They're not actual columns, and they're on 3 sides. In the front, they don't even have them. And you'll notice that when we go around the building.
That's a good place to ask. We have a question in the chat which kind of connects to one of my questions. I want to know, what architectural research do you use when you plan these buildings, Al? I know your research process is pretty intense.
Well, I do a lot of online searching. And in the case of the White House, I searched, I can't even tell you how many days and days and days, finding every image I could. I stumbled across the White House Museum website, and I was able to get a lot of pictures, sometimes from the inside, so that I can interpret it to the outside. You can get blueprints of the White House, but it's so low resolution and such small scale because it's a huge building. The drawings must have been enormous, the original drawings, that it just made it impossible to get the information off the actual blueprints and things. So I worked with downloaded images that I found pictures on the internet. I downloaded, print it, and then I would measure them and start making proportions.
Okay.
So the whole thing is done just from photographs and proportions. I did not even do drawings for this edifice. Early in this, in my reliquary series, I would do drawings and actual drafting. I was a draftsman when I was a young man, and that's contributed hugely to what I can do now. But I've gotten to the point where I don't need drawings. I just need images, and then I make my own little calculations on a pad, and then I can cut all the materials and arrange them.
I'm glad you brought up your drafting background, because that was one of my follow-up questions. I know as a kid you wanted to be an architect, and you have a background and worked as an engineer. What prompted the shift into the art world, Al?
Well, I was getting enormous urges in some interior place. It's really kind of inexplicable, but when I would pass through certain places, like if I was driving or walking through the slums of any area, I grew up in the slums of Brooklyn, and so that would give me an emotional response that just wanted something to come out. My first paintings were of the slums and gang places and all that. That's the stuff that started me off, but I was always getting urges and urges, and it was driving me crazy. And so I went out and started drawing and painting, and that was somewhat satisfactory until I discovered sculpture. That's when I really, blossomed, I would say.
As a bronze casting, correct?
Yeah, bronze casting was a big thing for me for about 10 years. And I built a foundry and really developed my skills there. And I did a lot of figurative work at that time. But this is the reliquary series, of which I consider this a part, is probably the best I've done. But not just the best, it's the most comprehensive. It encompasses everything from that I've learned in my entire art career. It all goes into this, and I'm really pleased with the development.
It's an incredibly powerful piece. When you see it in person, you really get a sense of its power and the scale and the size and the weight of it. A few more detail shots here. And I know we'll talk a little bit about the roof when we get to some of the process images.
Yes.
But you can see like all the different dimensions that you've captured.
This is a very complicated structure. When we see pictures of the White House in the media, it always looks like a two-story building. You see the main floor and then the second floor, and then there's the balustrade around what looks like the roof line. And what you're looking at here is the residential level, which is not visible from street level. The balustrades hide all that. And I actually didn't, when I started, I didn't even know that was there. I didn't know that there were courtyards in the front. I didn't know, these are all discoveries that made this entire thing take much longer than I anticipated, because I thought I was going to do a two-story building, and I ended up with a four-story building.
Yeah.
I would like to point out before we leave this image, the roof has a lot of chimneys. These are actually there, and all those chimneys are magazines from submachine guns, Uzis, Tommy guns, things like that. And then there's pistol barrels sticking up out of those magazines.
Okay.
I also want to point out the paving stones on the residential level, which is also repeated in the lowest level, the street level. And those are all shell cartridges cut down and then glued in.
We have a good image of that towards the end of the slideshow. We have another question in the chat, Al. So asking a little bit about the patina. How do you get the patina, and when did you decide on this particular type of patina?
Well, I actually thought about doing it white and then adding rust over the white to make it look like it was corroding. But I decided to make it look like it's already really completely corroded. So it was a decision I made along the way. And interestingly enough, once I make a decision of what I'm going to do, I can't be talked out of it. And I'll address that later with the bombed mosque, which the Crocker Museum owns, and we do have a few images of. But when people see what I'm doing, and they, like so many of my friends saw this when it was black.
Yeah.
And that was one of my options, to keep it black with a little bit of rust. But as I decided to go complete all the way rust, I couldn't be talked out of it. Lots of my friends told me they liked it better black or this or that. I don't care what anybody says. I want to accomplish my vision and then put it out in the world. I love these rusts, that the patterns, and you have to be close to see that. This, on the left, you see the front door of the White House. And it's actually quite short. This whole thing is very tall. And on the right, the windows of the street level are almost 20 feet tall. They're amazingly high. I had no idea when I started that this thing was as complicated as it is, or as detailed.
And just to let everybody know who's tuned in, to keep your eyes out for the image with the two guns that are creating the doorway. We should see that in process a little later on.
This is one of the courtyards that is right behind the wall in the front of the building, where people drive up and go through the front of the White House, where the red carpet would be. I didn't even know these were there. There's what used to be a carriage house down below, but right with those double doors in the back. What's there now, there's a bowling alley, a flower shop, a carpentry shop, and all sorts of things down there now. But I have pictures, photos I downloaded that show horses and carriages down there in the early days of top hats and such.
So you spent some time looking at sort of the architectural evolution of the building itself too, in the process?
Yeah, you know, the residential level wasn't always the residential level. It used to be housekeepers and storage and things like that. And it's been through many iterations. The architecture itself, it's been rebuilt and redesigned 3 or 4 times over the years. It was a major, major reconstruction of the White House in 1950 under Truman. It was actually falling apart, and they kept the outside, and they completely gutted the inside and did steel structures and got rid of all the old rotting wood. It's pretty amazing. Great history if anybody wants to research it. The White House Museum is online is a really good place to find great archival photos.
And so we arrive at the Divine Ammunition, talking about how things evolve over time. I wanted to ask, to sort of kick us off, what sort of themes and subjects were you exploring with this particular body of work, Al?
All the works in this exhibit have to do with religion and violence. And to explain what I'm doing, when I started this series, I was inspired by a trip to Italy where I saw lots and lots of reliquaries in churches and in museums and such. And I had an epiphany when I saw a finger reliquary, and it for me it translated into trigger finger, and I started relating the violence of guns and bullets to the reliquaries. But once I started, I realized I was only addressing Catholic imagery, and I needed to be more inclusive. So I wanted to do Islam and Judaism as well as Catholicism and Protestant. And so the hook that I developed was the architecture. Architecture, most religions have typical architectural look. So you can look at a church and you can know it's Catholic or Protestant. You can look at a synagogue and you know it's a synagogue, not in every case, but in many cases. And so certain signature styles developed over time. And so that became the main connection for me, is that all these religions don't do relics and they don't do reliquaries. The Catholics do. And so there are a few reliquaries in the other religions. There's maybe 2 relics in Islam. I'm not going there. You know, I don't want to upset. I try not to upset anybody. I'm trying to be respectful of all the religions. And so I do things in the most respectful way I can imagine, but yet still have that sense that it needs to be interpreted. And it's the viewer that's going to interpret it. I'm not telling them how to see or think. I just want to, you know, promote that involvement, that people will look at it and start thinking about what and why, and as well as how. But the why is very important.
How do you handle some of those difficult conversations with viewers?
They're not difficult for me because I explain to people how I'm trying to be respectful to all the religions, and I use things in a way that doesn't. I don't think it's interpreted in a negative way, although some people might look at it in a negative way. But once they realize that I'm trying to get people just to think, they start looking at it with that way. You know, often in some of my exhibitions, there's a video where I'm explaining that sort of thing, and they can then reapproach the material and think of it more once they see that I'm trying to get them just to think and nothing more. That's a strong point for me.
Okay.
Is to provoke thought.
It's not the greatest quality image, but at least gives everybody a sense of the scale of these works and also a little bit of the layout of the exhibition.
Yeah, that's the bombed mosque. For those who haven't seen it, in the back, we're going to see a couple of images more. And this is a Protestant church. The Protestant actually, in the 19th century and early 20th century, had a more signature style than they do today. Today, a lot of religions are experimenting architecturally and expanding. But for a couple hundred years, there was kind of a traditional look to a church of this type or that, or a synagogue. Whereas in Judaism, they had Moorish style that was developed in the mid 19th century that continued into the early 20th century. And that was an attempt to create a style sort of like what churches did, that Jewish communities wanted to have a recognizable style. But that evolved, and now everybody's doing modern architecture, and it's all changed. But I like the traditional old stuff myself.
And speaking of evolution, when you look at some of these images and fast forward to now, do you feel like your work has evolved over those 5 years?
Oh, yes. I started out with simple, smaller reliquaries. Once I adopted the architectural angle, you know, to represent the religions, then they started getting bigger. I would like to explain that in any of my work of this series, the main elements determine the scale. I don't think I'm going to make a piece 2 feet long or 3 feet long or 5 feet tall. I choose my main elements that will represent the architecture, and then everything gets proportioned out from that. So I've always worked with just proportioning everything, and I've always worked from photos that I download. Just that earlier on I did drawings, and later on I didn't need to, but basically I just look at photos and measure them and proportion them, and you know, it works. This is
The last time you were at the Crocker, which was really entertaining, apparently, it was before my time at the museum. Just a sort of interesting tidbit type question. Do you remember what you spoke about, Al? And what topic you covered?
that was a really good lecture. I showed a little bit of my earlier work in figuration because it's also got a political angle, and then I showed how it evolved into the reliquary series. But this image you see with the flag, or the portion of the flag, and a cityscape behind it, I did that in 1968 after Robert Kennedy was assassinated. And that was the third assassination in a short time. And so I took a corner of the flag where the stars are, for 3 stars with representing John Kennedy, Robert Kennedy, and Martin Luther King. And the 3 splats of blood also represent them. And that's the skyline of Manhattan in 1968. And it's done as a collage with guns and bullets. I had no idea at that time, none at all, that I would be doing what I'm doing now. I mean, I wanted to do figurative art, but after the assassination, I was so incensed that something had to come out of me, and this is what came out of me. And it sat in storage for decades and decades after I made it. I only exhibited it once, but it really, really prefaced the work that I'm doing now. I mean, I find it an amazing connection that in 52 years ago or whatever it is, that I came up with that image, and that what I'm doing now is very representative of that. That's pretty interesting to me. Anyway, back to your question.
No, following on from that, I wanted to ask, because it's almost feels like 5 years to date between the 2 shows, and both exhibitions sort of bookend the Trump presidency. And considering the political climate we find ourselves in at the moment, do you feel like your work is more relevant now than ever?
Absolutely, I do. I think that I've matured, my work has matured, and my ability to communicate has evolved also. And that's one of the nice things of getting older and having all that experience behind you. You bring all that experience to what you're doing in the moment. And I think I'm at my most effective, and my strongest work is coming out now.
We're sort of moving on to the third part of the talk now, is looking at sculpting the White House. I wanted to ask you a couple questions about your studio, Al. I know things are sort of meticulously organized based on different aspects. Do you want to talk a little bit about the atmosphere in your studio?
Sure. Well, you can see a little bit in the background there on all those tubs. They're full of guns and gun parts. Some are full of bullets, and some are full of cartridge shells. I have to be organized because I have to have every caliber, every size, so that when you do assemblage work, you do have to have choices. And so the more choice you have, the more effective you're going to be. This is how I laid out the White House. You can see I'm on some cheap wooden base that I, just use it as a layout, because I don't know if it's going to be right until I see it. And you can see some of the photos that I download, and just a lot of the elements. And so I always lay things out like these pistols and the archway of shells. I lay it out to see, how's it going to look? How's it going to work? Is it going to be proportional? And you can see, as you mentioned earlier, the guns in the front door. These guns, of course, weren't the correct length. So I had to cut the grips on both and then weld them together. And you'll see a picture of them welded. But they're overlapped at this point in the front there because I'm trying things out. I try out everything I can possibly think of, and then I end up with what I feel is the best solution. So you see a lot of guns laying around there. They're all the different guns that I'm trying. I didn't end up with some of the things I start with, but I just keep moving on. So what I've done is drill holes and mount the columns to see the sense of scale. and it got frightening. My table wasn't big enough to hold the whole thing, and so I had to extend my table to make it work. So let's move on to the next.
Sort of on the back of that point, Al, we have a question in the chat. Do you use specific gun parts or ammo for their shape and size, or because of meaning? You know, the thing like a type of gun like an Uzi. I know you mentioned Tommy guns early on.
Yeah, I did choose 19th century guns for the White House. I wanted to get as close to the period as I could, but that doesn't always work out because I don't always have the choice. In this case, I did have 19th century guns to play with. What you see me doing there is grinding. You see some sparks. We had to cut many, many thousands of cartridge shells just for the roof patio, the patio down below and the roof floor above. We probably had over 8,000 shell cartridges to cut. And each time I cut one, there's a big sharp burr, and it's also big enough that it won't allow us to put things close together. So they all have to be ground off, and that's what I'm doing. And another artist friend of mine in the background there is doing the same thing. At the end of while we were doing all that preparation for the last parts, I had as much as 3 and 4 people, friends, coming over and just helping me cut and grind and do that, because normally I do it myself, but it takes weeks to cut that many bullet shells and grind them flat and get them to be the same height. The thing is, every cartridge shell has a different length. Every caliber makes it a different length, or even several lengths for that caliber. And so I have, when I want to use them and match them, I have to cut them all to the same length. So that's extraordinarily time consuming and labor intensive.
And I love this picture, is like because of those safety goggles you have on. In the prep for this program, you're telling me they're military grade, if I'm remembering correctly.
Yeah. Well, I go to gun shows to get parts, and I ran across these goggles, and they're great because they really hug your face, and the sparks don't get in there. What you're looking at on the right-hand side are the capitals of the columns. There are 18 machine gun barrel columns in the White House, some in the front portico and the others in the south portico. And each of these capitals have 17 parts.
Yeah. Each
has to be cut, ground, and in this case, I riveted the shells. And they call them Roman capitals, not Ionic or the other Greek types. These are called Roman capitals. And this is just an indication of the beginning of how labor intensive. 17 parts for each of those. And then I had 18 columns to make those 4. That's next slide. These are the corbels under the first roof line. And each of those has to be spaced and welded. I will point out, for those who don't do metal work, every time you weld metal, it wants to distort. Mm-hmm. And so you're going to see a lot of clamping and stuff like that. Let's move forward on that. Here's an example. To weld those corbels, I had to clamp. Oh, look how many clamps there are. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, just for this small section. Mm-hmm. That's to prevent warpage. Everything wants to warp. And so as we weld, we hold it down, and then I'll move something over and clamp it again, and then weld some more. This is part of the south portico under construction. And I did everything in sections that would then be joined later. And then, of course, trying to design this seamless joining of the 3 sections. That was the hardest part.
And at this point, how many hours are you spending in the studio constructing all of this, Al?
Well, I was working, I would say, a normal 8 to 10 hours a day. And I had an assistant working me full time. His name was Ben Harris, incredibly good metal worker. I was really lucky to to have him. He even brought skills to the project that I didn't have, and that enabled me to design even more than I could have if I didn't have that particular assistant. He worked with me for 3 years.
Okay.
And it was a great pleasure.
I know
welded. These are the guns that will be in the front of the White House, the main front door. And so I cut those grips and then weld them and then file them and finish them so that, you know, they look seamless. Here's the South Portico coming together. Look how many clamps I've had to have. I want to point out on the upper left, you see all those little round stains on the metal. Those are weld burns. Those are things. When you weld, you get this burned look. It's a heat mark. So each of those little corbels will have a weld. This is that labor intensiveness.
Yeah.
And all those clamps are all about not letting things warp out from all the heat. These are the railings that go on the South Portico. I had those laser cut.
Okay.
And the posts are a 1/16 by 1/16 of an inch, and the rails as well. And I had 3 different angles to design for the different stairways. And then I had to curve them afterwards, just bend them, and then weld them all together and weld them in place. Personally, I couldn't, at my age, I can't do those tiny welds at all. And my assistant is an incredible welder, and he was able to do these tiny welds. I can't even see to do that at my age, you know, looking through a darkened welding helmet. This is a stack of windows that are just about to be, we were putting in and welding the mesh for the window separators. Each of those are stacks. Some have a Palladian triangle and others have arches. There are screws that go all the way through the shell cartridges from top to bottom.
Okay.
These are things that nobody would ever know or see, but it's built really strong. So I have screws in every one, and there are 18 parts to each window that have to be assembled and welded. So again, there were 72 windows in this section you see, and 18 parts to each of those lower level windows. Incredible amount of labor.
Yeah, I love this image because you start to get a sense of everything coming together, right?
Yeah, this is before we put on the upper level. This is, you can see, it's really still really hard to see where it separates, but I would say it's right at where the north and south porticos meet the walls.
Yeah,
those are the separating points. I try to hide them as best as I can. You can look in the background and see all the equipment and junk in the studio. There's a lot of stuff. The studio is full of all kinds of things.
Yeah.
This is...
sorry, I go back to that one.
That's all right. You can look in the background and get a sense of the expanse of the studio and all the things in it. It's pretty amazing. That's the north portico before the roofs were put on. This is the railings around the top, and I want to point out that each of those cartridge shells has a screw going all the way through and then welded on both ends and then capped on top and bottom. Again, labor intensive. I had to drill and tap threads on the top and bottom and then weld it in place. I make these things so it will never fall apart. You probably could drop it and it wouldn't break, maybe just distort. Okay. And on the left side are the residential level windows. And I think there were like 20 some odd, I forget how many. But again, really labor intensive to make those double casement windows out of steel and then weld in the mesh for separators.
As we're looking at these sort of detail shots, we have another question from the chat. Oh, great questions, everyone. Please keep them coming. Have you ever felt a connection with other miniature architecture in history museums, like doll houses, historic homes in the DC Building Museum, etc.?
Well, I'm aware of it. One of the things that I think is actually part of the charm of the work I do is that what I call the dollhouse effect. Everybody likes a good miniature. A good miniature just sort of fascinates people. There are people who do really superb dioramas and stuff like that. This is a much larger scale, of course, than a diorama, but there is a dollhouse effect that is very pleasant for people to look at, and I think that enhances how people approach the work. This is a close-up shot of a milling machine, where this is one of those examples where I didn't have the skills with this machine that my assistant did, and he was able to mill out. Let's go to the next shot. Mill out these forms, which are done in sections and then welded together. You can see the weld burns, which I get rid of later, but this was super complicated. If I was going to do it in individual pieces, it would have been super hard. But using the milling machine really worked out, and my assistant Ben was instrumental in making that happen. Here's how it's applied. And that the color, of course, is a bead blasted color of steel. And you could see how it just fits in. And of course, it wasn't yet attached. I colored everything separately and then I welded.
That's a great sequence of events, sort of showing the steps and then how it sort of finally ends up on the sculpture here.
Yeah. And could you go back for a second? Part of the parting line is right at the stairway, that 3-step stairway that parallels the wall, and I had the connecting point go under the stairs, so it appears seamless. I have all these little tricks to hide, one big seam. It's better to have the seam move around so it's not obvious.
And there, some images of your assistants and you.
Yeah, these are two of my artist friends that are helping me glue the floors, the walkways. There were 4,000 shell cartridges and 4,000 nuts, hexagon nuts. They're alternated. I like using industrial materials to invoke the military industrial establishment. I want the military is obvious. I want industrial stuff in there too. And most of my religious reliquary sculptures have gears and other symbols of the industrial. In this case, I'm using nuts and things like that to make that reference. These are being epoxied down. This takes a lot of time too. Yeah. And so being short for my deadline, I had all my friends coming in, cutting and gluing and helping out. That was really great.
Yeah, I was going to ask if it becomes meditative after a while, and then you mentioned deadline, and I thought I'd best not ask that question.
It is. When you're grinding thousands of things one after the other, it's a very Zen experience. You get into a mindset and a rhythm, and and there were some things that are so rhythmic. I would time it because I have some clocks around with a second hand, and I say, okay, I can cut one of these every 20 seconds, and I can grind it clean in 15 more seconds, and then I can calculate for 8,000. How many hours is this going to take me? It's pretty intense. Again, more gluing stuff, really difficult.
And I know this is a section you were particularly interested to talk about, the way things change as you're sculpting. We're looking at the roof now.
Yeah, this is you can see the beginning of the residential level. I hadn't put in the sunroom yet, but I had to have all these structures that are shaped to support the roof. So there's all these little braces that will ultimately, it's sort of like post and beam construction, but it's at the same time shaped to support a sloped roof with 2 different slopes. It's pretty intense. You can see the welding torch there. And next to my gloves is a rheostat that we step on to do welds that activates the TIG welder. Pretty intense. This is a shot of something that didn't work out. In trying to use as much armament as I possibly can in a sculpture like this, I tried to cover the roof with shells, but it looked more like a tile roof, and I thought it was really not working, so I got rid of that. But I had already spent so much time preparing all those things and cutting them and fitting them, but you know, that's how it goes. These are the roof sections that you just looked at that were covered with the shells. Every line you see there is a separate piece. So if you count how many lines there are, those are all that many separate pieces that have been welded together. Again, labor intensive. And then once it's we make the whole line, then I cut the angles and try to get everything to fit as well as I can.
And that's sort of everything coming together now. Yeah,
this is the front in the north portico with the Palladian triangle. That's the finished roof, which in the back you can see it, the central element at the ridge of the roof is extended, and that goes into the other roof going the other direction. So I had to anticipate that sort of thing. And here you can see the finished roof coming together. We're welding all the parts for the next section. And so lots of clamping and stuff like that. But this is very, now on the left side, you can see the so-called sunroom. There were no good pictures online of that from the exterior. I had to figure it out from interior shots of Nixon talking to his people.
Yeah.
It was interesting. And before that, the Kennedys used that as a nursery for their kids. That, you know, like a kindergarten room. It's amazing how many different purposes it had. I found a photo of Eisenhower barbecuing right outside that structure. It's amazing how you just have to keep looking around to interpret what's going to be. I couldn't get good photos.
But this is a great photo of you in the studio. You look really focused here, Al.
I was. I wasn't even aware someone was taking a picture.
It was a great detail shot.
Yeah. This one you can see a vice grip holding the railing to a step because we were just about to attach all those parts. And again, we got to keep it from distorting. Mm-hmm. Notice the little posts at the bottom of the rail. I had to bend those railings around and make those little cute little posts because that's what they're supposed to look like. And that was really hard, but fun.
Yeah, and that's sort of back to some of the images we saw at the beginning.
Yeah, this was an amazing project. Yeah. I never did a project that long.
So that sort of brings me to my final question for you, Al. If we had to imagine Al Farrow returns to the Crocker in 5 years' time, where do you think your practice will head next?
You know, I'm not 100% sure. I feel like I've done a lot of reliquaries. I'm working on 4 new ones right now that will take a little bit of time to finish. But I don't see myself going into a purely political direction. I've started experimenting recently with ink drawing. Okay. So that may take, ink paintings. I'm making my own ink and having some fun like that. And as I get older, I have to question, I'm 77 years old right now, and I have to question how long am I going to be strong enough to do this kind of work? How long can I afford to continue to support a studio of this size? I have a lot of things to consider for my my old age. There are a lot of uncertainties and unknowns at this point, but I am definitely going to continue working as an artist without doubt. I'm not 100% sure what form things are going to take. If my inspiration comes up because of something that happens in the world that gets me inspired, I'll do something about it, because that's how I'm a social commentary artist. I'm a social critic. I feel that's my place. And so if something comes up and I get inspired, I'll do it. But right now, who knows?
Wait and see. Keeping us in anticipation, Al. So I know we answered pretty much most of the questions in the chat during the conversation, and we didn't go too over time, so that was pretty good. So to end, I wanted to share this quote. It might be kind of difficult to see, so I'll read it, but it's from your longtime gallerist, Catharine Clark. I've represented L. Farrow's work for 30 years. The gallery is 30 this year, so my entire career. Interestingly, I re-met L when I was in my early 20s, at the time of founding my gallery. As it turned out, a decade earlier, Al Farrow was the artist who was in the ballet studio where I trained in San Francisco. He often sketched the dancers, including me, but also took class. His dedication to artistic practice is profound, and he took 8 years of classical ballet to better understand how the human body works and then could be rendered. While his interest in rendering the images of dancers was brief, most of his work has been concerned with social justice and the human condition. He is the only artist I know who has made images of ballet dancers in the 20th century where their positions and movements are accurately conveyed. Most people interpret it and get it wrong from a technical standpoint, and their work is often insipid to boot. Somehow, Al manages to avoid both of those traps, a testimony to his skillful eye and, as I said, his commitment to mastery of rendering his subject accurately. I thought that was a nice place for us to
Very nice.
end off. So thanks for sharing that, Catherine, if you're watching. Al, I do want to say a big thank you for taking the time to chat with us about the White House and walk us through your practice. It was really a privilege and an honor to sit down and chat with you.
It's a pleasure, and I really appreciate the opportunity to do this. Thank you.
Take care, stay safe, chat soon.
Thank you. You too.
Thanks everyone for tuning in. I hope you enjoyed the program. I do want to remind you to sign up for some upcoming programs we have coming up over the next week, and then next month we have the Rogue Book Club with Director of Education Stacey Shelnut-Hendrick, and then we have our new Equity in Museum series with Manager of Public Programs Michelle Steen. I hope you enjoyed tonight's program. Take care, stay safe, and good night.